Hello and welcome to a very special midweek edition of the American Compass podcast. I'm Oren, Chief Economist at American Compass, and we are doing the very exciting three-man pod. We have not only myself, but also both Josh Hammer and Sohrab Ahmari here for a really fantastic discussion about what just happened in the Middle East, just as much what just happened in the New Right coalition, lessons learned, points of actual agreement and disagreement, what it means going forward. Really, really interesting. And I think they have been two of the most effective and articulate spokesmen for what have seemed like the maybe two poles of perspective within the conservative coalition, but they also agree as much as they disagree. And so I think it's a great illustration of where things stand, where there are ongoing debates, what still needs to be worked out, and really glad we were able to bring it to you. Before we do, of course, let me tell you about what's going on at Commonplace this week. Today, a really great feature from Brandon Showalter on why Democrats can't quit gender ideology. And we will have more to come as the week progresses. So check that out. Of course, subscribe to Understanding America, where I this week was writing about 3 interesting facts, things that were not supposed to happen, as data emerges showing that Japanese automakers have in fact been eating the cost of the tariffs rather than passing those on as higher consumer prices. As it turns out, we can in fact secure the border, and it's not climate change that was causing the crisis there. And as we see financial markets and the finance industry completely fail to deliver on its promises, and instead see an entire private equity industry underperform your grandmother's index fund. So I think some interesting lessons to be learned there. Of course, The New Conservatives is out. I'd tell you, you have to buy it now, but if we're being realistic, you'll have years and years in which you can buy it. So let me just recommend you buy it right now. And with that, I can think of nothing better to do than pass you on to this conversation with Josh and Sohrab. Enjoy. And here we are with Josh Hammer and Sohrab Ahmari. Thank you guys both for hopping on this discussion.
My pleasure.
Good to be with you guys.
I think there are no shortage of folks out there very interested in how you guys think about what has been going on over the last couple of weeks. I am among them. And so I will lob in some thoughts of my own, but really want to look at sort of where are the agreements versus disagreements, both in thinking about what did happen in the Israel-Iran conflict, to the extent we can even use past tense. Obviously, events will overtake all of this again at some point, but also what it means going forward for how particularly conservative foreign policy should be defined, how it seems like it might be, and what the contours of the coalition would be. So let me start here, just kind of a question for both of you, and then we'll be off and running. But would love to just have you kind of give your sort of 1 to 2 minute view of how you make sense of what happened, to what extent at the end of the day it aligned with what you think a good American foreign policy would be, and to what extent you think it diverted in problematic ways. Sohrab, we will begin with you.
Sure. I think that from a U.S. perspective, the decision to directly join the conflict was a big gamble that so far has worked out relatively okay, but that from a larger perspective looks like a betrayal of 2 elements of what made the Trumpian agenda so attractive to so many kind of younger conservative intellectuals, and actually what made Trump popular, Trump the president himself, in terms of getting elected in 2016 and 2024. The first is, just the fact that President Trump ran on a pledge in 2016 in which he characterized the kind of Mideast conflicts of the post 9/11 era as stupid disasters and so on. And in 2024, the RNC platform had pledged to, among other things, to quote, prevent World War III. And so, okay, we are not in World War III, and I'm happy to get into, what's been called the kind of the panikin is the new term for it. The panicins, like panicking over World War III and what that all means. But just as a kind of, popularity matter, this is was not a popular move. You know, a YouGov poll showed that only 16% of Americans want to get directly involved in the conflict. A Brookings Institution poll found that an overwhelming majority of Americans, including super majorities of Democrats and independents, would prefer to resolve the Iran nuclear dossier through diplomacy. So he did something that is unpopular, even though it surged in popularity among Republicans during the operation, as any war typically does. That's one. And the second one is, you know, obviously it's the promise which I share deeply, and I know lots of people in the administration do, and frankly, there were lots of people who were dismayed by what happened. Obviously, mostly they speak off the record or on background, and that is that, you know, the future strategic challenge for the United States lies in the Pacific region, that our major adversary is China, and that we should try not to divert resources that are scarce to other areas, but rather we should allow our allies to stand up on their own to make prudent decisions for their security with our support. And, you know, the initial premise of the Israeli operation was that Israel was taking care of business, you know, that it was that kind of a rhetoric. And as many of its supporters had said, like, we don't want Israel even to be too much under U.S. support, because that also means U.S. constraints on Israeli action and so on. And yet on the second day of the operation, they formally requested American help. And, you know, the USS Nimitz was literally diverted from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. So in terms of a test of how serious we are about the so-called pivot to Asia, which has been a bipartisan commitment since at least the Obama administration, this was a failure as well. And if there's more of it, and if this portends a trend, potentially, then that's more, even perhaps more disturbing than those domestic elements that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you. I took a little bit longer, but please give Josh similar.
I of course will. I used the 1 to 2 minute guideline, knowing that you have to multiply that by 2, and so that was a terrific, right. A terrific rundown. Josh, how do things look from your perspective?
Okay, so great to join you guys. I'm delighted that my good friend Sohrab went first there, because now I know exactly what to respond to. So, you know, I'm not used to disagreeing with Sohrab, by the way. This is somewhat of a new development here, so we'll see how this one plays out. But I do think that I disagree with all three of Sohrab's major points that he made there. So I will respond kind of point by point in kind. So the first major point, probably the single most important point, is whether or not this is an aberration from the Trump doctrine, from nationalist realism, from Jacksonianism, or whether or not this is actually a perfect encapsulation, a distillation as to what it looks like in practice. That is probably, if I had to guess, Oren, going to be the single largest area of disagreement if I had to kind of foreshadow this conversation between Sohrab and I. Sohrab clearly seems to think that this is aberrant and not what President Trump has campaigned on. On the contrary, I think that this kind of prudential strike, a tactical maneuver that took roughly 37 hours from when the B-2 bombers left Missouri to go to Iran, back to Missouri there. This is exactly what he did the first time around when it came to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, when it came to the assassination of al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, various other examples as well. In fact, Michael Anton, I remember, when he left the administration the first time around, went to Foreign Policy magazine in 2019 to lay out what he referred to as the Trump doctrine, which has been referred to at many times as Jacksonianism. That is a term that well, it goes back to Andrew Jackson, of course, but it was kind of popularized by this national interest essay from Walter Russell Mead in the 1990s, which refers to this kind of general mentality that you are not interested in getting involved in the world stage. You generally subscribe to the old Washingtonian farewell address guidelines about bewaring of foreign entanglements, but when the world stage wants to meddle with you, you're not afraid to lash out in pinprick prudential fashion. So I view this as completely consistent, as a perfect encapsulation of Donald Trump's foreign policy. I think that this is MAGA America First in action, is to take care of a decades-long bipartisan, at least rhetorically, nominally bipartisan, sought-after foreign policy objective, namely the setting back or neutralization of the Iranian nuclear program, and to do so in a way where there were zero American casualties. And of course, as it seems like we all agree on, these fears of World War III or a broader conflict involving Russia or China simply have not materialized. So I view it as entirely consistent, frankly, with the president's worldview. He is not an isolationist. He is obviously not a neoconservative either. I, too, am neither an isolationist nor a neoconservative. He is a third-way nationalist, realist Jacksonian. That is exactly what this particular strike is. The second point, when it comes to the popularity, I think there's a bit of a sleight of hand here and perhaps a bit of a conflation between when the American people are polled as to whether or not they want to go to war with Iran or something like that there, where the American people obviously answer no. I, too, by the way, would answer no. But when you phrase the question slightly differently to the American people, do you say, do you support striking Iran's nuclear facilities if necessary to defend the national interest, to defend a potentially imminent acquisition of nuclear weapons there? The key is all in the polling, you see. And there was a poll that I saw on CNN. My buddy Harry Enton was throwing it on screen a few days ago there, where I saw 79% of even Democrats supported U.S. prophylactic preemptive action when it's phrased closer to the latter than to the former. That number for Republicans skyrockets. There was another recent CBS News poll that showed that 94% of self-described MAGA Republicans actually support this action, which is really just astounding. And it kind of raises the obvious question as to why folks like Tucker Carlson are running to defend the 6% in the purported name of MAGA. I don't really know the answer to that. You'd have to ask folks like Tucker themselves. The final point that I will just make really briefly there is on China. Sohrab and I are in complete and utter agreement that China is the number one threat there. I discussed this in my book. I've written about this, spoken about this time and time again. I also see this differently from a China-specific angle, though, for the following reason. In order to actually accomplish this much sought-after, again, purportedly bipartisan pivot to the Indo-Pacific there, it would behoove us to have a relatively more stable Middle East, right? And the way to do that is to make sure that Iran and its various proxies are not going to do things like shut down the Red Sea with a bunch of Iranian regime-funded Muslim pirates there with the Houthis in Yemen, things like that. You have to have the Iranian regime hurting and kind of have the different axis, the Abraham Accords axis of Israel and non-Islamist Arab states there on the ascendant in order to actually effectuate this long sought after pivot to the Far East and China. So I think it actually ends up legitimizing and hopefully kind of laying the groundwork for this long sought after pivot to the Far East as well.
Excellent. Well, to some extent, I now will just go back and say, well, all right, well, Sohrab, what do you think of that? But I think that sort of very well kind of frames up a lot of the points of disagreement that people have been grappling with, and also underscores the places where the extent of the disagreement maybe isn't so irreconcilable in some conditions. The one thing I want to add in, Sohrab, your thoughts on is, and I may just be the one with the weird, quirky view on all this, but to me, the actual U.S. decision to go or not go with the B-2s was in some respects the least significant part of all of this. That you had sort of Israel, a U.S. ally, waging this very aggressive war. We will probably never know whether the U.S. actually approved it beforehand, wanted it to happen beforehand, wanted to prevent it from happening beforehand. But that there was a much broader drama going on, of which the U.S. decision to bomb or not bomb, I would argue, was a fairly small plot point. And so I'm curious, kind of as you sort of address the points Josh made, to what extent do you think this really is the crux of the matter, versus to what extent is what is going on with American foreign policy at this stage a lot broader than just to bomb or not to bomb?
Let me just address your point first before panning out. I agree with you that the question is larger than to bomb or not to bomb, right? There are that question should be placed, at the tail end of a whole bunch of other questions, and I think that question was forced upon the United States by Israel's decision. Now, so let me go back to the Jacksonian point. I agree that President Trump is not like a Quincy Institute, American conservative type isolationist. I mean, he certainly recoils from that label, and nothing in his first term suggested that that's what he was. Let's recall, for example, that he actually broke with the Obama administration in arming the Ukrainians with lethal aid. Gave them javelins that they had long asked for. President Poroshenko asked me, when I interviewed him during the Obama administration, just being like, well, we gave up 1,200 warheads, give us 1,200 javelins. And it was Trump did that. I take that. I once interviewed then Senator, just before he was named President Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, and he said that basically that President Trump adheres to a Jacksonian doctrine, which is don't get into things, but if people punch at you, then, you know, the way he put it, I can't remember the exact quote, but it had some kind of cussy quality. It was like, then f them up or f their faces up, something like that. And so I get that. The problem is that the determination of the U.S. policy apparatus, and we get into the war's aftermath too, but the determination of the U.S. policy apparatus was that at the point that Israel short-circuited the policy was to try to reach a negotiated settlement for all sorts of reasons over the nuclear issue. Now here it becomes an empirical, factual question, and I think I disagree with you, Oren, that like we will never quite know. I spoke with about a dozen individuals, you know, like in administration industry insiders, congressional staffers, Republican and Democrat. Remember, even the Democrats' senior staffers have access to the White House or to the defense establishment, and not one person across the partisan divide, across these people, believe, and I think it's a very serious, I mean, it's a very unserious position to try to hold otherwise, that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu had like planned this complicated dance for like 60 days to try to like get to that particular arbitrary date. And President Trump has never been so hard about dates anyway. You know, and then to try to trick Iran, lull Iran to prepare the way for an Israeli strike. What I've heard, rather, is that what happened was just like a couple of days before the invasion happened, U.S. intelligence got word that it was going to happen. The two men jumped on the phone, and Bibi said, "Yes, you know, Mr. President, we're going to do it." And Trump said something like, "This is going to blow my diplomacy. I don't like it." And then a pause and said, "But maybe you can do something. I don't know." And you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu took that kind of mixed signal. Some people described it to me as a red light and a green light. Other people described it to me as a yellow light. Others described it to me as a flashing green light. Whatever, take your traffic light metaphor pick. Took that as a solid green and went in. And President Trump's initial instinct was to basically disown the thing if it curdled, which hence Secretary of State Marco Rubio's initial statement, in which he was like, "We didn't do anything. It's not us. Good luck, you know, whatever." And then to own it if it appeared to be successful. And in the early hours of the strike, it was, you know, typical like spectacular bravura performance, mainly by the Mossad, I would say, more so than the Israeli military. It was the intelligence that really carried the day for the Israelis. Then President Trump decided to like kind of own it, and he liked the kind of coverage he was getting on Fox News. This is kind of the consensus view of what happened. But from the point of view of U.S. policy, given the fact that we had settled on trying to resolve this issue diplomatically, and I will tell you some of the advantages of doing that earlier, then what the Israelis did was kind of like short circuit the situation and do one of those things which, you know, American presidents have good relationships with their Israeli counterparts for the most part. But there come times where if you read any presidential memoir, there's like the commander-in-chief wanted to pull out his hair over what the Israelis did or what they cornered him into. And I think on the whole, this is that kind of an episode. You know, it's just that, you know, no president likes to be surprised. No president likes to be seen to have been surprised or caught off guard. So it kind of made sense for Trump to kind of own it and roll with it. But as an American, it kind of bothers me that, you know, like we had set on a course and a different course was kind of imposed on us by Israeli action. I realize this is somewhat an element of fact against fact, account against account, but I just don't believe the devious Trump, like working with devious Machiavellian Bibi to hatch this all along. However, and I'll say this last point, because there are other things to say, but I want to not monopolize the mic here. But the you know, what the downsides of that from the point of view of trying to leave these regions and make the pivot to Asia is the fact that the United States, by owning it, or Trump by owning it, has given the impression that the United States uses diplomacy and negotiations as a ploy for kinetic action. And that's going to have ramifications. I think it's the most serious one. I was talking to senior administration officials yesterday, and it's the one thing that they were most concerned about. For example, when it comes to trying to reach a negotiated settlement over Ukraine, which I think all three of us want something like that. That's a stupid, wasteful conflict of Ukrainian lives, Russian lives, American and European resources, and so on. But remember, world leaders have seen the administration use diplomacy, not even to say, they were tough negotiators, but to have come to appear to use diplomacy itself as a military ploy. That has consequences for the United States that I think are not good if we want to be able to settle certain conflicts. Yes, in some cases by slapping around bad actors like Iran and its proxies, but in other cases being able to negotiate with those bad actors, whether it's Moscow or Tehran or whoever. And I'll stop there. We can get into how the war played out. That's a separate question. Yeah. I just don't think it was effective as Jacksonianism, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Well, so Josh, I'm curious. First of all, I think it's very helpful to separate out the factual questions from the sort of philosophical ones. I'm curious sort of to what extent we are working from common facts on this, and then whether we are or not, sort of what lessons you take away. Because I find myself taking away a very different lesson from that narrative.
Well, look, there's a lot to respond to. Again, I'll try to be as brief as I can here. So none of us know, I don't think any of the three of us know exactly the song and dance routine, right, that went between the White House and the Prime Minister's office over the past few months. I think it is probably reasonable to speculate that both of the extremes are untrue. On the one hand, this was not 400D chess. I don't think, for instance, that Trump going to visit the Emir of Doha was intended as just a giant kind of red herring to try to say, we don't like Israel anymore, we like the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't buy any of that. To me, that is just way out there and kind of, Alex Jones, tinfoil land. That's not my game. That's not what I do. On the other hand, I think it seems pretty clear to me that there probably was longer, more ongoing back channeling, if nothing else, than at the very last minute there. The extent to which Donald Trump gave a red, a green light, or a yellow light, I don't really know. Frankly, I'm disturbed at the notion that any foreign sovereign country feels the need to get a permission slip to take care of an existential threat. And that speaks of the need for Israel to be more self-reliant, frankly, which is a major theme of my book, Israel and Civilization, is that Israel should not be so dependent, frankly, on the United States. And frankly, from an America First nationalist perspective, we should not want our allies to be so dependent on us so as to get kind of a permission slip. We want self-reliant allies to patrol and secure their own regions in a way that defends to our shared national interests there. Or in your recent Substack about how Israel is potentially a perfect America First nationalist ally, I think would be buttressed further if Israel were more self-reliant and did not feel a need to come begging for a green light of sorts there. So that whole thing kind of disturbs me there. But having said that, I do think that the reality for Prime Minister Netanyahu was such that he probably got closer to a green light to do that there. So I'm not entirely sure that this was kind of Israel just totally co-opting diplomacy. I think this sort of makes interesting points, right, about potential ramifications of U.S. orchestrated diplomacy and then military action when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine theater and elsewhere. I guess from my perspective, Iran is a somewhat different situation. I'm not sure that it can be neatly applied to various geopolitical hotspots across the board for following reasons. The primary reason, and far be it from me to lecture my good friend who was born in Tehran on this very question, right? But I guess the primary reason is that this regime has essentially been, whether you want to call it a declared state of war or an unofficially declared state of war, with the United States since the formation of the regime. It is literally the raison d'etre of this regime. They had pilfered and swindled in kleptocratic fashion hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars from their own people to try to accomplish what seem to be their two leading goals, which are the elimination of what they refer to as the little Satan of Israel and the big Satan of the United States there. It's not the same thing. They do seem to have Israel more directly in the crosshairs, both for reasons of geographic proximity and various other exogenous reasons, maybe just old-fashioned anti-Semitism. But they come after the United States time and time again. I mean, I don't need to do a whole history here of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombings, the Khyber Towers bombings in Saudi Arabia, the Qasem Soleimani supplied IEDs in the roadside of Iraq, in Fallujah and Al-Anbar province during the Petraeus counterinsurgency, and on and on and on it goes there. So Iran is a different regime. And look, I mean, in theory, diplomacy is always great, Oren, when diplomacy is possible. But like many, I was always skeptical of the Witkoff negotiations, not because I don't desire a diplomatic outcome, but because Iran has done all that it can to avoid diplomacy and been hiding the extent of its nuclear program and its progress for 2.5 to 3 decades at least there. So it's not obvious to me what kind of diplomatic settlement is even feasible in the abstract with a regime like this there. So I guess I'll just stop there, I guess.
Well, yeah. So I want to push you guys each on an element of this, and it's funny. I'm now going to, on one hand, put the bombing, the B-2 bombing is completed aside, and then turn right around and focus specifically on them. But Sohrab, I'm struck by your point. I think exactly right that the U.S.-Israel relationship is such a unique one, and on one hand, obviously Israel relies on the U.S. for various things. On the other hand, it does assert a certain independence in ways that tends to drive U.S. leaders nuts. In your ideal version of what good America first, American foreign policy looks like, what is the relationship between Israel and the U.S.? In other words, why is, I guess a preliminary question would even be, why is the U.S. conducting this negotiation with Iran at all? But is Israel even supposed to ask for a green light? Or is it entirely the point that if Israel wants to fight with Iran, that's for Israel and Iran to decide?
Yeah, I think that the restraint faction, which, like, as Josh pointed out, both camps in this debate, and it is kind of a family debate. It's gotten very heated because we're talking about war and peace. But just like the hawkish faction, the restraint faction has arguments that are more or less sophisticated. On the most sophisticated side, I think the argument was in the early hours of the Israeli operation that it was something I think I saw you put out there, Oren. My friend Daniel McCarthy put it out there as well, which was, well, this is Israel's war, and in this new dispensation, whatever you want to call it, we want to let our allies have that kind of operational freedom to take care of their needs, and sometimes what they do will redound to our benefits, and sometimes we can just live with it even if we don't like it. Unfortunately, I mean, I think that what that problem runs into, and it's not unique to Israel, is the nature of the U.S. alliance structure is not there yet. It's not like the U.S. is friendly to one of two warring African countries and maybe gives one material support and says, your business if you want to fight this war. Like, that's kind of remote. And that actually, by the way, that might be plausible. Like, we do support certain African regimes, whatever. But we can be kind of, have the attitude that, okay, that's your fight. If you feel like it's your national interest, we might even, support you in certain ways, but we're not going to get involved. The problem is that, Israel and certain other, I think, say European theaters, it's not like that. And the proof is in the pudding. The fact that, Josh himself said, I'd want Israel to be self-reliant. Why does it have to ask for a permission slip? Amen. Problem is, because of the nature of the conflicts that in some cases it's taking on, within 24 hours, Israel had formally lodged a request for the United States to intervene in its behalf, which is why the question of whether this is a neat Jacksonian operation in and out, I think, is more complicated than Josh made it sound like early on. We were talking. Go ahead.
Well, no. So that's exactly the question I was going to pose to Josh. Conversely, is I think the case that we want Israel to be more self-reliant and not ask for a permission slip fits very well in the America First framing. It is then a problem when Israel turns around in less than 24 hours and formally asks for help, right? Like, doesn't how this played out and the Trump decision that to then, in fact, engage somewhat undermine the sort of rosy case for this being what we want it to be?
I'm not sure that account is entirely confirmed. I've heard mixed reports on that, to be very candid with you. I was in Israel when the war started. Israeli media was not saying this for sure. No one in Israeli media, from what I saw, was confirming that the prime minister's office had made a formal request for the for the 101st Airborne to go join their operation there. So I'm not entirely sure that
but just to hopefully put us on a kind of common factual basis here, whether it was in the first 24 hours, whatever, I don't think it's under dispute that it was the Israeli government's position that it wanted the United States to engage with B-2s and bunker busters at Fort Al, right?
No, I mean that's a matter of public record. I mean,
yeah,
Bibi said that to Trump at his second White House meeting. There were people in the meeting who leaked to the New York Times. Neither here nor there. For that's another story. But yes, I mean, from Israel's perspective, and I'm just speculating here because I'm not an Israeli, but I think that they view Iran as a mutual enemy of the United States and Israel, which frankly makes a lot of sense, given that that is exactly how the Iranian regime views themselves, as being avowed enemies of both of these particular countries. We can debate the reasons for that there, but that is kind of just the way it is. Now, having said that, I do know from a lot of my friends over in Israel, this is also not disputed. Israel absolutely had a backup contingency plan to do whatever it had to do without the U.S. getting involved in any way whatsoever. They absolutely had a plan to go down into the 300-foot below the mountain nuclear facility in Fordo and kind of this covert James Bond style blow up the whole thing operation there. Extraordinarily risky. Who the heck knows whether it would have been successful there. But they absolutely had those contingency plans in place, which makes sense because Iran has been the defining issue of Israeli foreign policy, especially Bibi Netanyahu's statesmanship for decades now. They've had a lot of time to put this sort of thing together there. But yes, look, I would much prefer all of America's allies, not merely Israel, but our European allies who are so dependent on our NATO subsidization and so forth there. I would prefer for all of America's allies to be more self-reliant. That is not the current reality of the world that we are living right now. But the way that it plays out to me, Oren, the way that I see what happened over the past 2 weeks, the so-called 12-day war, I don't see the United States getting coerced or strong-armed into fighting Israel's war for it there. That is not my read on the situation at all. President Trump is perfectly capable of sticking two middle fingers at Netanyahu and saying, go to hell. In fact, he has said that repeatedly many times over the years there, because as Sohrab says, there are very real times when the White House and the Israelis tend to disagree. That's just the way it is there. Trump and Netanyahu have had their ups and downs there. Rather, it seems to me that what happened is this. There was some undetermined extent of discussion, of back-channeling between the Americans and the Israelis prior to the June 12th, June 13th commencement of the Mossad IDF operation inside Iran. Rubio did put out this statement distancing the Americans from the Israelis. That statement, by the way, was hotly debated within the State Department by lots of people. There were a lot of people on all sides of that debate there. That was the statement that ended up getting out there, but there were a lot of people, frankly, within the government who I know I've spoken to them who hated it there. So that was a very hotly debated statement. But what Donald Trump, Oren, one thing we know just talking about the man himself, he's a bit of a boomer insofar as he loves cable news. He loves watching TV. I genuinely think that ultimately, if I had to speculate, the number one reason why Donald Trump decided to enter this conflict was because he watches a lot of Fox News, and he was watching on and on and on cable news, analysts, talking heads, correctly praising the masterful job that Mossad above all and the IDF to an extent were doing inside of Iran there. That probably, if I had to guess, is why he decided to kind of come in there. But the key point, and this kind of gets back to the case for Israel as an America First ally, regardless of this self-sufficiency argument there, the point is that the IDF and Mossad has such astonishing success, in gaining aerial control over the skies. They are taking out the IRGC commanders, the nuclear scientists, that. They laid the groundwork really, really, really well so that these B-2 bombers could come in and out without a single shot being fired because Iranian air defense and so forth was so grievously wounded by that particular point of the conflict. So, to use a very crude basketball term, I'm a sports fan, it's kind of something of an alley-oop of sorts. If you're a basketball fan, it's kind of like Kobe Bryant to Shaquille O'Neal back in the day, given the alley-oop. It's a very crass analogy that this is war and peace. I don't want to downplay it here. But that's kind of more or less how I see it there. I think that Donald Trump saw a very potential low cost to achieve a decades-long sought-after foreign policy goal, and praise be to God, that's exactly what happened.
And of course, ultimately, Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal had an awful falling out leading to the collapse of the Lakers dynasty, and one of them having to leave LA. A very nice analogy nonetheless. Sohrab, let me sort of give you a final shot at any piece of this you want to pick up again, and then I want to play a few fun hypothetical games.
I mean, I want to go back to the question of the frame, which I think Josh and I agree that Trump operates according to this kind of third position between, full restraint, full isolation, and neoconservative hawkery, which is what he called the Jacksonian model. Like I said, we don't punch, we don't enter, but when we enter, we like really bloody your nose and we get in and out. The question with that is whether or not this was, an effective intervention on those terms. And, I don't want to go out there. I think there's a stream of commentary that is especially picked up on by, like, if you're on MSNBC, that's the message you're getting, which is that according to some Defense Intelligence Agency report, all it did was the operation set back the Iranian nuclear program by a few months. If you dig into the details, as an expert like David Albright has, that's not the case. I mean, there was this report, but with low confidence, the DIA said in the worst case scenario, the most that the U.S. achieved was to set it back by a few months. However, in terms of the larger point, there are lots of analysts, including Albright, who say that there are lots of unknowns about the effectiveness of the strike. I do know because I was listening to Iranian state TV the whole time, and days before, especially hours before the actual B-2 bomber operation got underway, I heard them again repeatedly say that, well, we've removed most of the fissile material out of Fordo, and have moved them to other facilities. There are other talks, where they seem to be under the impression that this would be a kind of cosmetic strike. Again, I think that's an exaggeration, but it needn't be a cosmetic strike that is completely ineffective to raise the question about whether or not what was achieved was Iran's ability to move its enriched material around and maintain its know-how, because you can't kill know-how. And now we're in a situation in which, Iran can, obviously it'll be under monitoring, I don't deny that, but that enforcing and inspecting its nuclear program will become harder going forward than it was before the Israelis short-circuited this diplomacy. I think that's a legitimate question, and you see people who are not like peaceniks, at all, or anything like that, raising that. And they're like, again, becomes a little bit of, I realize it becomes a little bit of a battle of the experts. And I hate that, but that's the nature of, this debate. And it's why it's so hard to like neatly separate what we want ideally or in principle from like the nitty gritty kind of warp and weft of battleground reality. So, okay, so that's one question. And then the second is, how much, again, I don't want to get into really nitty gritty battleground assessments, but I think it's worth putting out there that there were downsides to this operation from just the strictly Israeli perspective, which cast doubt on its ability to be an ideal America First ally. In other words, by jumping the gun at a point against a nation that is just much bigger. Israel could have, pounded Iran for, just leveled the country, and they would have survived on like potatoes and grass, but they would have kept firing those missiles, and the Israelis were running out of interceptors. And I'm telling you that psychologically, those kind of hypersonics and those kind of, you cannot unsee the footage of the hypersonics landing in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, etc., in terms of kind of Israeli prestige. Again, I don't deny the spectacular gains. I don't deny the fact that the Israelis for a while had basically unimpeded, control over Iran's airspace, running from Western Iran all the way to the capital, Tehran. I don't deny all that. But the ceasefire may have been as much to like let up or allay the possibility of a regional war as it was to just prevent Israel from getting into an attritional escalation with Iran, which Israel cannot beat. It can short of like using nuclear weapons, which it won't do likely, that model of missile after missile, it can begin to hurt. And so, again, by having jumped the gun and revealed that it's really dependent on the U.S. to call, to do X, Y, Z, to call a timeout and partition the parties, I do worry that this episode cast doubt on Israel's value as an America First ally.
Want to throw out some hypotheticals, because I think to Sohrab's point, a lot of this turns on very specific facts of, well, what in fact did happen, what if this were true, what if that were true. I think in foreign policy in particular, it is therefore incredibly important to work through hypotheticals, because that is what tells you whether the theory holds together and how it might play out. I think the first hypothetical, and we'll flip around, start with you, Josh, on this, is, I think a lot of the theories for, why the existence of this conflict at all, certainly the U.S. involvement was a problem, was because of ways it could sort of spin out of control. And so, one dimension of that would be, okay, what if the U.S. really does start facing kind of serious retaliation? That is, what if there are sleeper cells? What if there is terrorist attacks carried out in the U.S.? In your vision of the Jacksonian American foreign policy, how does that play out? We've done our pinprick punch in the face to Iran. Iran responds in ways that actually cause us significant pain. Are we now on the escalation ladder to a quagmire, or what is the off ramp?
Sure. Let me just briefly respond to a couple things Sohrab said, Oren, and then I will answer that. Look, no one certainly. I don't think anyone on this call knows kind of the stress that the Israeli homeland was facing during this better than me, for the very simple reason that I was there. I was literally there when the sirens went off. I was there with my wife, our 6-month-old baby girl. We were going in and out of bomb shelters. We ended up evacuating. It took us 3.5 days to get home. It was quite an ordeal. We went to the border in Jordan, to Amman, Jordan, to Cyprus. I ended up meeting Governor DeSantis because this was a Florida-adjacent program. It was a total mess. I literally saw a factory with my own eyes take a direct hit from a ballistic missile, and there was harrowing, billowing black smoke for forever to see. So way too many missiles were getting through. So Israel is going to have to work on their air defense, clearly. That has been an underappreciated part of this particular narrative, by the way. So Sohrab is completely correct about that, is that for all the masterful work that Mossad and the IDF did inside of Iran, the Israeli homeland absolutely was getting pounded. Again, I lived that for better or for worse. But having said that, kind of, Oren, and returning to your question here, look, there's been a lot of talk of Iranian Hezbollah sleeper cells, Iranian proxies. I mean, this is a long-standing issue. Okay, the tentacles of the Iranian regime. This is a 4.5-decade-old regime. They absolutely are here in the Western Hemisphere. Hezbollah, in particular, has or at least had a very sophisticated operation in Central America, going down into South America as well. It seems to me to be a fool's errand to try to not do what you deem to be in the prudential American national interest, for risk of the potentially incrementally larger reprisal of a sleeper cell here on the home front. Now, I'm very worried about it, obviously, especially as someone who wears a kippah, is visibly Jewish. I go to synagogue, kosher restaurants there. I mean, I'm kind of the prime target, right? So, I mean, I don't dismiss this out of hand there. And it's doubly a concern for the very simple reason that, as Tom Homan has been saying time and time again on cable news, Joe Biden let in whatever the number is, 8 million illegal aliens, or I forgot the exact number, but a lot, way, way, way too many. And Kristi Noem just arrested 16, I think, Iranian nationals here illegally. Whoop-de-doo, that's fantastic. But that's not exactly going to make us all sleep a whole lot better at night, is it? So it's definitely a concern. I don't mean to downplay it there. But if America deems that neutralizing Iran's nuclear program is ultimately in the national interest, then you simply have to do that there. And I'm sorry, but not to make a very simple point there, but I guess I'll just say it anyway there. This obviously and transparently has not led to anything remotely approximating the World War III catastrophists said that it would there. I'm sorry, but people like Tucker Carlson look really stupid right now. They just do. I'm just going to say it that bluntly. They look really, 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 really stupid, because Iran telegraphed about a 6 to 10 or whatever the exact 12 a ballistic missile response to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That response was quite literally telegraphed to both the Qataris and the Americans there. We had time to prepare there. It was a total face-saving kabuki theater bit of WWE wrestling kefabi, BS by the Iranian regime on the home front there. And we now know that neither Russia or China would swoop in any meaningful way to try to prop up and save their purported ally in the Middle East. Russia is obviously greatly extended. in the Ukrainian theater. Their military has become something of a paper tiger, as we've seen in real time there. China has much bigger fish to fry there when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative and their own kind of ailing real estate market and so forth at home there. So we now know in real time as well that Iran is not going to be propped up by allies in the world. Say that is a very valuable lesson. The final thing that I will do, just kind of bring us back to this recurring kind of theme of this conversation about the utility of Israel as an America First ally. It seems to me that Donald Trump would not have gotten into this. And to be clear, by got in, it's kind of almost, I feel silly saying it because we're literally talking here about the B-2s operating 37 hours from Missouri to Iran and back. This is not a boots on the ground thing or anything remotely close to that there. But okay, fine, fair enough. The reason, it seems to me, or among the reasons that Donald Trump got in was, one, because he was so awed and wowed by the Israeli masterful operation inside of Iran, and two, the fact that, yeah, they actually really grievously took out a lot of missile launchers, ballistic missiles, air defense, the top commanders, and so forth there. So he probably felt pretty secure about going in and doing this there. And whether or not the program was set back by a few years, which I guess is what the Israeli Atomic Association or whatever is called, they're saying it was set back by a few years. Whether it's that, whether it's a little more than that and close to the kind of Trumpian Hegseth line of obliteration there, it's probably maybe it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know. None of us really know, frankly, on this conversation. But regardless, that is a good thing. That is a good thing. I mean, let's not miss the forest for the trees here. It is commonsensical to deprive a regime that chants death to America on a daily basis, and yes, has been trying to kill and maim Americans for 4.5 decades. It is commonsensical, if you can avoid a single American casualty at an infinitesimally small cost, to deprive that regime of the most dangerous weapons in the world. I think it's just common sense on it.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Sohrab.
Oh, sorry about that. So I just want to jump in and I guess address your hypothetical first. Actually, I'm with Josh on this. I mean, I don't, if the United States has determined that bombing their facilities or doing something, getting into a much more extended confrontation with Iran or any other adversary, is a good idea, then is a prudent idea, then I wouldn't, step back from it for fear of, like sleeper cells or whatever. I would step up domestic homeland security to try to mitigate that rather than, not take the action. Again, it's about the utility of the action. I'm going to put a provocation out there. Right now, they're among the kind of on the hawkish side. Again, I'm in some ways a hawk. Like let's talk China, and you'll hear a very different set of notes from me. But whatever. But in the hawks in this current debate, there are two camps. One is like Josh, who are like grateful, they think everything went really well. But then you have like Mark Levin's and the Emily Schraders and others of the world who are extremely angry. Dave Reboy, someone that Josh and I both know, and actually I consider a friend, is in the angry camp. Because I think they're right, actually. I think they're right. I think there were two ways. One was a negotiated settlement in which what was at stake. And again, this is partly the Iranians' stupid fault that they didn't just say yes to Trump, which was it was called a better than Obama deal, meaning greater concessions that Iran made than they did to Obama under the JCPOA, in which enrichment would happen in a consortium model with the Japanese and the South Koreans involved, maybe on Iranian soil, maybe not, but at levels that are pretty low. I think if you notice Vice President Vance's wording, it was very careful when he made the tweet, which I took to mean we were going to go in, was he said, I don't see why Iran should have enrichment well above the levels needed for civilian use. Not above, but well above. So anyway, there could have been some deal which the Iranians did take. But anyway, my point is that, either you could have had that, the better than Obama deal, et cetera, with U.S. inspectors was being contemplated, right? Previously, Iran had rejected U.S. inspectors. Already they had signaled that they'd be open to U.S. inspectors. Or you have to go in a big way to secure the fissile material, to possibly do regime change all the way. And I think their anger actually is kind of right, but the Americans had no appetite for that. Trump has no appetite for that. So what they got, I think, is like this kind of ambiguous strike, which now, by the way, President Trump having said he's obliterated it, could potentially mean no more involvement, right? And it becomes up to Israel to try to enforce it best it can, and it might have the kind of Lebanon-style freedom of operation to go in and hit this and that, but it's a far from perfect scenario. It could mean future involvement in the United States under some future administration that may be more inclined to go in, or it may mean lots of work for Israel going forward. But anyway, my point is, to answer your question, no, I wouldn't worry about the sleeper cell thing. If we've decided we're going to go in and it's in the national interest, then we're going to have more airport checks, or whatever. Or we're going to have more deportation, all that stuff. I agree with Josh there. But in terms of, like, what were the options? I think, like, people like Levin and Reboy and Emily Schrader, who are very angry at Trump, are actually right. If they really wanted the kind of, solution to the problem, it was either a deal or a full-on going in. And what we've gotten in time may be something different from either of those in ways that are pretty unsatisfactory from Jerusalem's perspective.
Well, let me just say one thing, which is, if I can, which is, if the Israelis wanted Ayatollah Khamenei to be dead, I predict that he probably would have died in the first 24 hours. It's not obvious to me that actually toppling this regime was what holding aside the American national interest, it's not obvious to me that that's even what the Israelis wanted to. They have the knowledge, presumably. They have eyes and ears throughout the entire country, as we've learned many times over the past few years there. It seems to me like if they wanted the Ayatollah to be dead, they could do that. In fact, there was one member of the cabinet there, Yisrael Katz. He at one point did say that we want regime change, but I think he was the exception rather than the rule. So it's not obvious to me either that Israel, let alone the U.S., legitimately wanted regime change there. What they really wanted was to set back, if not to obliterate, the Iranian nuclear program, which probably is the primary reason that Israel was quick to agree to this Trumpian ceasefire, because they accomplished their objectives. Now, Sohrab is right that the Israeli homeland was being hit. Again, I lived it. It was pretty harrowing, scary stuff at times there. But the primary reason I think that Israel was quick to agree to the ceasefire is because they legitimately believed, based on their own intelligence, that they accomplished their foremost aim, which was to seriously set back, if not obliterate, the Iranian nuclear program.
I just want to invite Oren, if you want, you should just tell us to do rapid fire with your other hypotheticals, because I'm coming up on my 2 p.m.
Yeah. No, I was going to tell you even better. I have a list of geographical and demographic facts about each country that we're going to run through, and whoever gets more of them correct is officially the knowledgeable winner of the debate. But no, I think, yeah, to your point, so I did want to kind of wrap up with just thinking through, okay, kind of, thumbs up and thumbs down is obviously much too simplistic, but first, a couple of things on this conflict, and then thinking about some other contexts. At the end of the day, I guess I would just be curious, to what extent would you say, look, there are lots of bad options here. Israel forced even more bad options on the U.S. in some cases. But at the end of the day, this seems like we're sort of living in the best of possible worlds, versus what points would you point to and say, no, ideally we would have seen something different happen here. So just sort of quickly, if you have a few you'd point to that you think are relevant. Sorry.
I'll go very fast.
Yeah.
Ideally, Israel would have put greater trust in the U.S. process. And then if the conclusion was we have to hit them, we hit them in a way that whatever. However, given the whole shebang that we ended up with, I have to say, at the end of the day, outcome's not so bad. It could have been much worse. Not World War III, but it could have been much worse. It could have been an extended commitment on the U.S. part, which would have basically shattered the president's domestic agenda. It could have been lots of bad scenarios. If regime collapse had happened, I wrote about that early on, it would have been a disaster for the whole region, including all the Arab states, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. That didn't come to pass. If the regime had collapsed, there was a possibility, I believe, but this is speculation, that the red line for the Russians and the Chinese to go in was regime collapse. And because actually the Iran regime proved fairly resilient, it's a systemic state. It's not like near Assad or something like that. We didn't come to that. So given all that, I think I can't lie and say it was just a complete disaster. It could have been, and I think recklessness is not to be invited because this time we did all right. However, I think we did largely all right.
Okay, well, but just to put you on one element of that quickly, and then we'll wrap up with you, Josh. I guess the question is, did we create any additional risks? In other words, at some point where events are out of control, are there points at which you think the U.S. should have been doing anything differently than it did that would have reduced the risks of those things that you were concerned about? Or did we steer roughly the best path we could given events outside our control as well?
I would say I would highlight 3 long-term risks that remain unmitigated.
No, sorry, not the question. In terms of what the U.S. actually did, are there places where you think Trump's doing something? Yeah, okay.
That's what I'm getting at. I think I'll go back to it. I think the use of the apparent appearance of using negotiations as a kinetic ploy, as a wartime ploy, is going to ramify in dark ways. Not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but the U.S. will have to make deals. Especially Trump is very much a deal maker. It's one of his best instincts. And I think if you listen to world opinion, like other, European, Asian, et cetera, media, if you pay attention to that has left a very bad taste, which is why, for example, Japan and Korea didn't show up to a NATO meeting. They had to at least symbolically register the fact that it's not even like they're negotiating in bad faith. It's like negotiating to hit is pretty, I think, damaging long term. Then the second one is, I do worry about other states in the region thinking, okay, the only path to real sovereignty is nuclearizing, not just in the region, but beyond. Any of these middle powers like Turkey being like, I don't want that. I better nuclearize. But you know what? I'm not going to be dumb like the Iranians and keep shouting death to this and that, but I am going to nuclearize. And so you have a proliferation effect. And third one, I think it did reveal these like dark and deep fissures on the American right about our relationship with Israel at a time when, what I've heard and sometimes see is a lot of the foreign policy, forget about AOC and Zohran Mamdani on the left, a lot of the foreign policy professionals that are coming up the DoD apparatus already, let's just say they don't talk like Tucker, but are closer to Tucker than they are to Josh. And I think they're pretty determined not to see a repeat of the 12-day war in terms of Israel short-circuiting a process that the U.S. has set in place. And that's, I think, more of a danger to Israel than to anyone else.
All right, Josh, 60 seconds, final word to you. Anything you would have wanted to see differently, or lessons learned, just here's something heading into the next crisis that will surely emerge that we've learned from this?
All right, real quick. I don't necessarily buy the increased fissures argument. Again, 94% of self-identified MAGA Republicans, according to CBS News, support this. That's much higher than just generic Republicans. Secondly, I hear Sohrab on the risk of nuclear proliferation. Seems much more obvious to me that nuclear proliferation would happen if Iran were to become nuclearized. That would actually get the Saudis and so forth to want to build their own programs themselves. But more generally, Oren, let's just conclude with this. The Middle East right now, after the 12-day war, if that nomenclature is actually going to stick with the historians, but right now the Middle East is the most stable and secure that it has been in, I think, all of our lifetimes, because the Iranian axis is seriously on the decline and the opposing axis is on the ascent. So if I think all three of us agree that China is a number one issue, the Indo-Pacific should be America's foremost theater of geopolitical, diplomatic, military, and so forth concern there, you have to have a somewhat stable Middle East to allow that to happen there. This was genuinely, whether it was purposeful or merely incidental, I suspect it was the latter, but incidentally, it happens to actually be in service of that long bipartisan desired foreign policy goal.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Josh Hammer, Sohrab Ahmari, this has been fantastic. You guys have both been incredibly articulate and thoughtful leaders in this discussion throughout the past, I guess it's 14 days now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oren.
Thank you. Good to see you, Josh.
You too, Sohrab.
And we'll be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.